In the brutal winter of 1888, a desperate father's debt was paid not in gold, but in flesh. Henry looked at his scarred, unwanted daughter and traded her to a solitary mountain man just to survive. The town called her a monster. He called her his salvation. This is their story. The wind howling through South Pass City, Wyoming, felt like a physical blow, carrying the bitter promise of a merciless winter. The year was 1888, and the dying mining town was a place where only the desperate or the damned remained. Amelia Higgins was a little of both. At 22, Amelia had long ago learned to keep her head down, her shoulders hunched, and her face hidden beneath the brim of a frayed wool bonnet. When she was just 7 years old, a kerosene lamp had shattered during a drunken rage of her father's, setting their small homestead ablaze. Amelia had survived, but the left side of her face, neck, and shoulder bore the brutal, twisted scars of the fire. In the unforgiving society of the frontier, where a woman's worth was often measured by her marriageability and her beauty, Amelia was considered ruined. Whispers followed her through the muddy streets, words like cursed, hideous, and monster. But no one despised her more than her own father, Henry Higgins. Henry was a man hollowed out by bad whiskey, worse luck, and a rot of the soul. He owned a failing cattle ranch on the edge of the Wind River Range, and his debts had finally caught up with him. He owed $300, a small fortune, to Gideon Black, the ruthless proprietor of the local saloon and gambling hall. Gideon was not a man who forgave debts. He had already threatened to take the ranch, leaving Henry to freeze in the wilderness. It was on a bleak Tuesday morning, the sky the color of bruised iron, that Henry dragged Amelia into the muddy thoroughfare outside Gideon's saloon. He gripped her by her thin, threadbare coat, his breath reeking of cheap rye. "She can work it off," Henry pleaded to Gideon, who stood on the boardwalk, a cigar clamped between his teeth, flanked by 2 armed men. "She's strong as an ox. She can scrub floors, wash clothes, tend the girls upstairs." Gideon sneered, looking at Amelia as she shrank back, her scarred cheek exposed to the biting cold. "I run a high-class establishment, Henry. My patrons don't want to look at a gargoyle while they drink. I want my money by sundown or I take the deed to your land, and I'll break both your legs for the inconvenience." A crowd had begun to gather, miners and townsfolk watching the spectacle with cold indifference. Amelia closed her eyes, tears freezing on her lashes. She wished the earth would open up and swallow her. She was nothing to her father but a bargaining chip, and even at that she was useless. Then the crowd parted. He was a giant of a man, standing easily at 6'4", clad in heavy buckskin, a thick buffalo hide coat, and a beaver pelt hat. A dense, dark beard obscured most of his face, but his eyes, a striking, piercing slate blue, cut through the gloom of the morning. Across his broad back he carried a staggering bundle of prime winter furs, fox, beaver, and wolf. This was Jeremiah Stone. The townsfolk stepped back, offering him a wide berth. Jeremiah was a ghost to them, a solitary mountain man who lived high in the treacherous peaks of the Wind River Range. He came down only twice a year to trade. He was known to be a man of few words, fierce temperament, and unparalleled survival skills. Rumors swirled that he had fought a grizzly bare-handed and won, a myth supported by the deep, jagged claw scars that raked across his own forehead and disappeared into his hairline. Jeremiah dropped his massive bundle of furs onto the boardwalk with a heavy thud. He looked at Gideon, then at Henry, and finally his gaze settled on Amelia. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away in disgust. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The furs are worth $400, Black." Jeremiah's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the frigid air. Gideon's eyes lit up with greed. "They are, Stone. You trading for supplies at the mercantile?" "I'm paying his debt," Jeremiah said, nodding toward Henry. A stunned silence fell over the street. Henry's jaw dropped. You're paying my debt? Why in God's name would you do that, Stone?" Jeremiah took a slow, deliberate step toward Henry. He towered over the older man, emanating a quiet, lethal danger. "Because you're going to give me the girl." Amelia gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Henry blinked, looking from the furs to the mountain man, and then to his trembling daughter. A cruel, disbelieving laugh erupted from his throat. "Her? You want her? The ugly one? Stone, the isolation up there must have rotted your brain. But if you're fool enough to trade a winter's fortune for a scarred-up workhorse, she's yours. Take her. Good riddance." "Father, no," Amelia whispered, terror seizing her throat. To be sold to a savage mountain man, dragged away from the only sliver of civilization she knew into the freezing, deadly peaks. It was a death sentence. Or worse. Jeremiah didn't acknowledge Henry's cruel words. He walked over to Amelia. Up close, he smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and cold, clean snow. He reached out, not to grab her, but to offer a massive, calloused hand. "My sled is at the edge of town," he said quietly, his voice meant only for her. "We have a long ride before the storm hits. Come with me, Amelia." He knew her name. That singular fact shocked her enough to silence her protests. With trembling fingers, she placed her small hand in his. He didn't yank her. He led her gently away from the jeering crowd, away from the father who had just sold her for a pile of dead animal skins, and into the howling, snow-blind wilderness. The journey up the mountain was a brutal, grueling trial of endurance. Amelia sat huddled on Jeremiah's heavy wooden sled, wrapped in thick furs he had provided, while he guided his team of Malamutes through the treacherous, snow-choked passes. For 3 days they climbed higher into the jagged teeth of the Wind River Range. The temperature plummeted, the air grew thin, and civilization vanished entirely. Amelia spent the journey in a state of numb terror. What did this giant of a man want with her? Why pay such a high price for a woman no one else could bear to look at? She imagined the worst, that she had been bought as a slave, a punching bag for a man driven mad by the isolation of the mountains. On the evening of the 3rd day, as a vicious blizzard threatened to swallow them whole, they arrived. Nestled in a sheltered basin, surrounded by towering ancient pines, and protected from the worst of the wind by a sheer granite cliff, sat Jeremiah's cabin. It wasn't a crude, hastily built shack. It was a sturdy, meticulously crafted home of thick, chinked logs with a smoking stone chimney that promised warmth. Jeremiah lifted her from the sled. She was too stiff from the cold to walk, and carried her inside. The interior of the cabin defied every expectation Amelia had. It was clean and warm. Cast-iron pots hung neatly near a large stone hearth. Braided rugs covered the sturdy floorboards. Shelves lined the walls, but instead of just hunting gear and traps, they were filled with books, dozens of them worn and loved. He set her down gently on a comfortable chair near the fire. "Thaw out," he instructed softly. "I'll see to the dogs." When he returned, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Amelia watched him like a cornered rabbit. She waited for the demands, the cruelty, the ownership to begin. But it never did. Jeremiah heated a stew of venison and root vegetables and served her a bowl before taking one for himself. He ate in silence, reading a battered copy of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations by the firelight. When the hour grew late, he pointed to a heavy wooden door. "Bedroom is in there. Bed is yours." Amelia clutched her bowl. Where will you sleep?" Jeremiah gestured to the braided rug by the hearth. "Fire keeps the floor warm." "But you bought me." The words tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop them, thick with shame and confusion. "I belong to you. Why are you being kind?" Jeremiah closed his book. He looked at her, his slate blue eyes locking onto hers, entirely ignoring the scarred side of her face. "I didn't buy you, Amelia. I bought your freedom." He sighed, running a hand through his thick hair. 2 months ago, I was down in the valley tracking a stray buck. I saw a man dragging a woman out of a barn by her hair, beating her for dropping a bucket of milk. I saw the town walk by and do nothing. I don't hold with cruelty. When I came to town today and saw Henry about to hand you over to Gideon Black, a man who breaks people for sport, I did what I had to do. You are not a slave here. You are a guest. When the spring thaw comes, if you want to leave, I'll take you to the rail depot in Cheyenne and give you enough money to start fresh. Until then, you are safe." Amelia sat frozen, the tears she had held back for years finally breaking free. For the first time in her life, she was not seen as a burden, a monster, or a piece of property. She wept until she collapsed into sleep. The winter months that followed were a revelation. Trapped together in a world of white, a quiet rhythm developed between them. Amelia discovered that Jeremiah was not a savage. He was a man deeply scarred by the Civil War, having served at Gettysburg where the horrors of humanity had driven him to seek solace in the absolute silence of the mountains. He had money. Gold he had panned years ago, but he preferred the simplicity of trapping and reading. He never treated her as fragile, nor as ugly. He taught her how to shoot a Winchester rifle, how to read the tracks in the snow, and how to bake sourdough bread over the hearth. In return, Amelia cleaned the cabin, mended his torn gear, and, as the weeks turned into months, she found her voice. They spent evenings discussing the books he read, debating philosophy and history. For the first time she laughed, and when she laughed, Jeremiah looked at her not with pity, but with a quiet, burning reverence that made her heart race. He saw the strength beneath her scars, the sharp wit she had hidden away to survive. One evening in late April, as the ice on the eaves began to drip with the approaching spring thaw, Jeremiah was whittling a piece of cedar. Amelia was reading aloud to him. She paused, looking at his large hands working the wood. "Jeremiah?" "Yes, Abby," he replied, his voice a comforting rumble. "The snow is melting in the pass." He stopped his carving. A shadow crossed his face. "It is. The road to Cheyenne will be clear in 2 weeks. I promised you a train ticket." Amelia walked over to him, her heart pounding. She reached out, her fingers gently touching the deep, jagged bear scars on his forehead. He closed his eyes at her touch, a small breath escaping him. "I don't want a train ticket," she whispered. "I want to stay with you." Jeremiah opened his eyes, pulling her hand to his lips and kissing her palm. "I am a broken man, Abby, a hermit." "And I am a scarred woman," she replied fiercely, "but together we are whole." He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time their lips met, a kiss born not of desperate ownership but of profound, hard-won love. It was a moment of perfect peace. But the mountain was not as isolated as they believed. 3 days later, the violent reality of the world they had left behind shattered their sanctuary. The barking of the Malamutes echoed frantically off the canyon walls. Jeremiah grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, Amelia close behind him. Riding up the narrow, muddy trail were 3 men on horseback. Leading them was Henry Higgins. Flanking him were 2 hired guns from Gideon Black's saloon, rifles drawn across their saddles. Jeremiah racked the lever of his Winchester, the metallic clack echoing sharply. "That's far enough, Henry." Henry halted his horse, a malicious grin splitting his face. He looked at the cabin, then at Jeremiah, and finally at Amelia. "I ain't here for trouble, Stone," Henry yelled, though his hand rested near his revolver. "I'm here to reclaim my property. The deal is off." "She's not property," Jeremiah roared back, stepping in front of Amelia, "and you have no claim here." "Oh, but I do," Henry sneered, pulling a folded legal document from his coat. "See, I found an old trunk belonging to Amelia's mother a few weeks back. Turns out my late wife's father was a prospector down in Colorado. He left a deed to a silver mine. Assayer in Denver says it's sitting on a vein worth $250,000. Henry's eyes locked onto Amelia with a terrifying, greedy hunger. "But the deed is in Amelia's name. I need her signature to claim it. She's coming back with me, Stone. Hand her over, or these gentlemen will leave you bleeding out in the mud." The sanctuary of the mountain was broken, and the real fight for Amelia's life and their love was just beginning. The silence that followed Henry's demand was heavier than the snowpack threatening to slide off the granite cliffs above. Jeremiah Stone stood like a monolith on the porch of the cabin, the heavy barrel of his Winchester lever-action rifle leveled squarely at the chest of the man who had sired the woman he now loved. The 2 hired guns from Gideon Black's saloon, a pair of notorious Wyoming regulators known only as Deacon and Bates, shifted uneasily in their saddles. They were accustomed to intimidating indebted miners and terrified homesteaders, but the giant mountain man glaring back at them possessed the cold, detached eyes of a seasoned killer. "I won't tell you twice, Henry." Jeremiah's voice was a low, guttural rasp that carried easily over the whistling wind. "Turn those horses around. The trail you rode up on is the same one you'll ride down, and if you're smart, you'll ride it fast before the next squall buries you." Henry let out a jagged, desperate laugh. He was a man driven utterly mad by the prospect of unimaginable wealth. The silver vein his late father-in-law had struck down near the Silver Crown mining district wasn't just a rumor, it was a verified, assayed fortune. But the cruel irony of Wyoming territorial law, which had granted women the right to own property independently since 1869, meant Henry couldn't just steal the deed. He needed Amelia's legal signature in front of a territorial magistrate, or he needed her dead and a forged will in his possession. "You don't understand the sum we are talking about, Stone," Henry yelled, spit flying from his lips. "It's $250,000. Look at her. She's a scarred freak. What does a monster like her need with that kind of money? Give her to me. I'll split $10,000 with you right now. You can buy all the trapping land from here to Montana." Inside the doorway, Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The familiar, venomous sting of her father's words struck her, but this time they didn't crush her. As she looked at the broad, unmoving back of Jeremiah, a profound, fiery anger ignited in her chest. For 22 years, she had believed she was nothing more than the scars she wore. Now, she knew she was worth fighting for. "She is worth more than all the silver in Colorado," Jeremiah said quietly, his finger tightening imperceptibly on the trigger. And she is staying right here." Henry's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. He nodded curtly to the men flanking him. "Kill the mountain man. Take the girl alive if you can. But if she catches a stray bullet, we'll just have Hiram Bennett forge the damn will in Cheyenne." The eruption of gunfire shattered the pristine quiet of the mountain basin. Deacon was fast, drawing his Colt Peacemaker with lightning speed, but Jeremiah was a veteran of Gettysburg. His reflexes were honed by surviving the deadliest wilderness on earth. Jeremiah fired first. The Winchester roared, and the heavy .44-40 bullet struck Deacon in the shoulder, spinning the man violently out of his saddle. He hit the freezing mud with a scream. Bates fired his rifle wildly from horseback, the bullets splintering the thick logs of the cabin's porch. One round tore through the heavy buffalo hide of Jeremiah's coat, grazing his ribs. Jeremiah grunted, staggering back a half-step into the doorway, returning fire and putting a hole through Bates's saddle horn, sending the horse rearing in a panic. "Get inside," Jeremiah roared, shoving Amelia fully into the cabin and kicking the heavy oak door shut behind them. He swiftly dropped the thick iron bar into place just as another volley of bullets slammed into the exterior. "Jeremiah, you're bleeding!" Amelia cried out, her eyes locking onto the dark stain spreading across the side of his buckskin shirt. "It's a graze. Don't worry about me," he grunted, moving quickly to the front window. He smashed out the glass with the butt of his rifle to create a firing port. "Get to the back of the cabin. Stay low behind the cast-iron stove." But Amelia did not retreat. The trembling, terrified girl Henry had dragged through the mud months ago was gone, melted away by the warmth of Jeremiah's absolute acceptance. She rushed to the corner of the room, reached under the heavy woolen blankets of the bed, and pulled out the spare rifle. A sleek, well-oiled Henry repeating rifle Jeremiah had painstakingly taught her how to use over the long winter. She moved to the adjacent window, keeping her head well below the sill, and checked the chamber just as he had shown her. "Abby, what are you doing?" Jeremiah barked, glancing over his shoulder, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror for her safety. "They are not taking me back," she said, her voice shaking but her hands remarkably steady. "And they are not going to kill the only man who has ever truly seen me." Outside, the situation was deteriorating. Bates had managed to calm his horse and had taken cover behind a large outcropping of granite. Henry had dismounted and was dragging the wounded Deacon behind a cluster of thick pine trees. The element of surprise was gone, but the attackers still had them pinned down. "We can wait you out, Stone," Henry's voice echoed from the trees. "You got no place to go. The sun's going down and the temperature's dropping. We'll burn that cabin to the ground with you both inside if we have to." The threat of fire sent a violent shudder through Amelia's body. Her left hand instinctively went to the raised, twisted scars on her neck. The smell of kerosene, the searing heat, the agonizing pain of her childhood trauma rushed back in a suffocating wave. She squeezed her eyes shut, paralyzed for a fleeting second by the ghosts of her past. Jeremiah saw her freeze. He abandoned his post at the window, crawling across the floorboards, and took her face in his massive hands. His thumbs gently stroked the unscarred side of her cheek. "Look at me," he commanded softly, his blue eyes fiercely tethering her to the present. "You are not that little girl anymore. You are Amelia. You survived the fire. You survived the cold. You survived everything. They will not burn this house. I promise you." Amelia opened her eyes, drawing a deep, shuddering breath. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. She nodded, raising the Henry rifle to her shoulder and resting the barrel on the splintered window frame. "Let them try," she whispered. The siege dragged into the bitter twilight. The temperature plummeted, turning the muddy basin into an iron-hard slick of ice. Jeremiah knew the freezing Wyoming wind was their greatest ally. Henry and his hired guns were city men, dressed for a quick ambush, not a prolonged standoff at 10,000 feet. "They're freezing," Jeremiah muttered, peering through the shattered window, clutching a superficial graze on his ribs. "Bates is losing his nerve." Suddenly, a concussive boom echoed over the howling wind. Bates, desperate to end the standoff and escape the cold, had hurled a stick of dynamite toward the cabin. "Down!" Jeremiah yelled, throwing his massive body over Amelia just as the explosive detonated near the porch. The blast shattered the remaining windows and blew the heavy oak door completely off its hinges. A thick cloud of pulverized wood, snow, and suffocating smoke filled the room. Coughing violently, Jeremiah pushed himself up, but his left arm hung limply, a jagged piece of wood shrapnel embedded deep in his shoulder. Through the clearing smoke, Bates charged the exposed doorway, his revolver raised. He never made it inside. Amelia, operating purely on the survival instinct Jeremiah had nurtured over the winter, leveled her Henry rifle. She didn't close her eyes. She pulled the trigger. The report cracked sharply over the ringing in their ears. Bates stumbled, dropping his gun, and collapsed onto the ruined porch. Gripping his bleeding thigh, he screamed, rolled off the timber, and scrambled desperately away into the blinding snow, abandoning the fight entirely. Only Henry remained. The smoke cleared to reveal the desperate old man stepping into the destroyed doorway. Henry held a double-barreled shotgun, his hands shaking violently from the freezing cold and his own maddening greed. He aimed directly at Jeremiah, who was struggling to lift his Winchester with his one good arm. "It's over, Stone," Henry sneered, his teeth chattering. "I'm taking her, and I'm taking the deed." "Father, stop!" Amelia stepped out from the shadows, placing herself directly between the barrel of the shotgun and Jeremiah. Henry's eyes widened. "Move, you stupid girl. You owe me. I kept you alive when you were nothing but a hideous burden." "You didn't keep me alive," Amelia said, her voice ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. She stared down the barrel of her father's gun without a single flinch. "You sold me. Jeremiah saved me. From you." She raised her Henry rifle, aiming it squarely at Henry's chest. "Drop the gun. If you pull that trigger, I will kill you." Henry stared at his daughter. He looked at the jagged scars painting her face, and for the first time in his miserable life, he didn't see a monster. He saw a woman of terrifying, undeniable strength. He saw his absolute defeat. His hands shook uncontrollably. He looked at the fortune he would never touch, the daughter he could never control, and the mountain man who had beaten him. Slowly, the fight drained out of him. The shotgun slipped from his freezing fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. Henry dropped to his knees in the snow, weeping into his hands. A broken man destroyed by his own avarice. Jeremiah slumped against the wall, a breathless laugh escaping his chest. Amelia immediately dropped her rifle, rushing to his side to press a torn strip of fabric against his bleeding shoulder. "I've got you," she whispered, tears finally falling freely, washing away the gunpowder. "You saved my life, Amelia," he murmured, his slate blue eyes filled with awe. "We saved each other," she replied, pressing a kiss to his forehead. 3 weeks later, the spring thaw opened the mountain passes. Leaving Henry bound and delivered to the local sheriff, Amelia and Jeremiah traveled to Cheyenne. They walked into the grand offices of Judge John A. Reiner, accompanied by the bewildered territorial lawyer Hiram P. Bennett. When Amelia presented the deed to the Silver Crown property and proved her identity, she officially claimed a fortune that made her one of the wealthiest women in the Wyoming Territory. Society expected the newly minted heiress to conform, to buy a grand Victorian mansion and hire Eastern surgeons to fix her face. They did none of those things. Amelia and Jeremiah sold the mining rights for an astronomical sum. They bought out the struggling ranchers bordering Henry's ruined property, expanding the land into a massive sanctuary. They built a sprawling, timber-framed ranch where the old cabin used to be. Amelia used her vast wealth to build the largest medical clinic and orphanage in Cheyenne, specifically funding care for children deemed unwanted by society. Through it all, Jeremiah remained by her side. He preferred the quiet of the pines, but every time he looked at his wife, he saw only the beautiful, unbroken woman he had traded a winter's worth of furs to set free. Amelia and Jeremiah's story became a Western legend, proving true beauty is forged in hardship. They claimed the Colorado silver fortune, but never abandoned their mountain sanctuary. Instead, they built a thriving ranch, funding a Cheyenne orphanage for discarded children. They passed away peacefully in each other's arms decades later, leaving a legacy that whispered across the Wyoming winds. The greatest treasures remain hidden beneath the deepest scars.